Tusk is a 2014 horror comedy movie which was written, directed and edited by Kevin Smith and was famously created on his very own podcast as just a spitball idea which then developed into a full movie. This movie is kind of internet famous more than it is famous in a traditional movie sense. It's well known among the YouTube community and various others, but didn't do overly well critically or financially. The reviews weren't that great for this film, which surprises me, to be honest, and financially it unfortunately lost money. With a $3 million budget and making just under $2 million at the box office, the film is relatively rare if you think about it as far as who has actually got to see it in the theatre. Now, as far as DVD and Blu-ray sales, far more people since then have had the opportunity to see it, but it's still not a film which is talked about as much as many other horror films. Now, is it the greatest thing ever in the horror category? Well, no, of course not. I don't think anyone would expect it to be. But what it is an interesting change from a traditional horror story. For one thing, although there are multiple characters in the film, they don't all end up in a scary situation together as they usually would. It's not that kind of horror film. The film revolves around one primary character, played by Justin Long, who runs a podcast, along with his friend, played by Haley Joel Osment, and they run a podcast based around funny internet happenings and stories and real-life occurrences that make good listening. And basically, in order to find an interesting story, Justin Long travels up to Canada, but, without spoiling anything too much of course, the story falls through and he's forced to come back. Before, though, he has the chance to come back, he sees an opportunity for another story which could potentially make his visit worthwhile. To visit an interesting old man with tales to tell, played by Michael Parks. And the rest is fairly obvious given the title of the film and what you could probably imagine in your mind. Now, from the way this film is spoken about, the way it looks in trailers, you would probably assume that it's a fairly gory film, probably very camp, and maybe even not very well made. But I would say on all three counts, those things are not the case. For one thing, this film looks great. The camera quality and the shots in the film, the lighting, everything about it, looks really good. It doesn't look cheap at all, in my opinion. As far as being campy, well, it is a comedy, but even so, it's not really that campy. There are, as you'd expect, a couple of annoying moments here and there by certain characters, but in general, the acting in the film is not bad at all, especially with a couple of actors more than others, but overall I had no problem with the acting in the film in any way and didn't find it a campy movie. Perhaps most surprisingly, though, of those three is the gore factor. I went into this film expecting it to be not necessarily gratuitous on a Hostel or Saw level, but certainly gory. And although there is some gore, nowhere near as much as I was expecting. Now, I'm not a huge fan of gore anyway. I don't dislike it, I just don't really need it to have fun in a film. So the fact that there wasn't as much gore as there could have been didn't really bother me. If you're going into this film expecting gore everywhere, in the same vein as films like I mentioned, such as Hostel and Saw and various others, you're not going to get that, because it's not that kind of film. The gore that is used is quite sparing, and I found effective. Overall, it's a film which is very difficult to compare to other movies that I've seen. There may well be obscure films here and there that it's similar to, but personally I found this film to have a very unique premise, a very modern premise in line with YouTube culture, etc., and I really enjoyed it for that. So what about my individual ratings? Well, first of all, of course, we have the story and plot. Overall, it's a fairly simple story, but at the same time, it's not really like any other horror or horror comedy that I've seen before. So I'm going to give it a 6. It wasn't mind-blowing or amazing or phenomenal in any particular way, but I like the essential concept, it's different, and there were points in the film which kind of flipped the script on you and surprised you about certain characters. One character in particular gets a number of twists and backstory additions throughout the film that make you more intrigued. So overall, from me, it's a 6. As far as specifically those characters and the motivations that they have, again I'm going to give it a 6, and unfortunately I want to give it higher in that regard, but as I said, there are a couple of annoying moments from some characters, and unfortunately the majority of the annoying moments that I picked up on were from the primary character played by Justin Long. That kind of hurts the film for me, because after all you're rooting for him, and the fact that he is not necessarily the kind of guy that you'd want to root for kind of hurts it for me a bit. Overall though, the characters are still interesting and you do root for him either way, so overall I'm giving it a 6. As far as the visuals and effects, I'm going to give it an 8. Those who have seen the film tend to talk about the effects fairly often, and for good reason. The effects that are used are effective. They don't necessarily have the most depth or realism of any special effects that you've seen in a horror film, but they're effective. They're interesting, and they do have a kind of horror/comedy element that the film is trying to go for. So overall, I'm going to give it an 8 in that regard. As far as the overall audio and sound in general, I'm going to give the film a 6, because although the sounds, the audio, the music in general does the job, it wasn't the most memorable music in particular, and there weren't really a huge amount of standout sounds or audio effects in general. So I'm going to give it a 6, above the baseline, but at the same time not necessarily anything to write home about. And finally, of course, we have the most subjective, to me personally, the rewatchability and entertainment factor. And for that, I'm going to give Tusk a 7, because this is the kind of film which I'm very glad that I did watch it, and it's certainly a movie that I would show to friends under the right circumstances if I knew that this was the kind of thing that they were into, but at the same time, it's not the kind of movie which I would choose as my first choice of horror film if I was looking to watch one, just to pop something in and watch it if I had a spare couple of hours. It's just not that kind of film. I will watch it multiple times, but it doesn't have the same level of rewatchability as some of my other favourite horror films, either in pure horror or horror comedy. So overall, it's a 7. And that means that the overall tabulated score, with all 5 of our scores put together for Tusk, is a pretty respectable 3.3 out of 5. Not as high as some other horrors which I've reviewed, but still certainly not a bad result for a film which didn't do all that well, either monetarily or in way of critics. But overall, if you haven't checked out Tusk and you are into films that are certainly in the horror genre, of course, not necessarily pure flat-out gut-bursting comedies, but with elements of dark humour and with stories especially that are different from the norm and have kind of an oddball quirkiness to them, then definitely check this film out. If that sounds like the kind of movie that you're into, I'd definitely recommend it, because as far as that category goes, and it is somewhat niched, but there are others, this film is one of the more polished efforts within that field of movie. So I enjoyed this film, and if you're that kind of person, you might too. But that's it overall for this particular pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.